Hi everyone, thank you for joining us and welcome to the 5th instalment of Sierra Club BC's Old Growth Forest webinar series. My name is John Griffiths. I'm a volunteer with Sierra Club BC and calling in from Victoria on unceded territories of Lekwungen speaking peoples. As you can see, our usual host Galen is away this week. He's up in northern Vancouver Island with some Sierra Club BC campaigners, a media team, and members of local Indigenous communities scoping out recent old growth logging and current forests that are expected to be logged soon. So he'll be back next week, and I'm sure he'll report back as to what he found then. I'm delighted to say that we have eco-futurist author and speaker Guy Dauncey joining us to give us our main talk today, which has the title Forestopia, 8 Ways of Protecting the Forest on Private Lands. In addition to Guy, we also have Sierra Club BC Senior Forest and Climate Campaigner Jens Wieting on the line, who will be helping out with today's call and also sharing some information with us. I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping points. For those using Zoom on a computer, which is most, you'll see an icon at the bottom of the screen that's marked chat, and clicking on this opens up the chat box. You'll see a brief intro in there from me and a bit of discussion from the group already. And this is the place for you to write any questions that come to mind during today's talk. We'll then do our best to cover these in the Q&A session in the second part of the webinar. We'd just like to thank everyone for the engagement that we've seen in the Facebook group, which as a reminder is called Sierra Club BC Volunteers. This week we've seen some amazing things shared, including a video of Cello Bride's incredibly moving cello performance as an apology to our old growth, where she's playing next to a very lonely Doug fir tree. If you haven't seen this yet, it really is worth watching. We also saw a very moving poem shared by Arlene Richardson for this, as well as lots of other engagement, which has been great to see. We'd also like to thank those who have carried out the action from last week and have handwritten a personal letter to Forest Minister Doug Donaldson calling for a halt to old growth logging. Now, there is a development in relation to this, and I'll now briefly hand over to Jens, who can share this with the group. So Jens, let me unmute you. There you go, and you can share this with the group.
Thank you, John, and hello, everyone. Really happy to be with you today and have Guy Dauncey as our guest speaker. That's fantastic. I'm in Vancouver. In fact, I'm the only Sierra Club staff member based in Vancouver, here on the territories of the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish people. And there's good news. It's not fantastic news, but good news in regards to the 109 hectares of ancient forest close to Port Renfrew in the Pachidat territory. So BC timber sales first had to delay the date for auctioning those blocks by 2 weeks. That would have been until tomorrow, May 10. But then after more and more public pressure and Sierra Club BC, Ancient Forest Alliance, Wilderness Committee, the Chamber of Commerce, and many concerned citizens from the concerned riding, John Horgan's riding, between Zug and Port Renfrew. The government shared the news yesterday that this bidding will be postponed. Right now, we heard different wording. I heard at least from one source indefinitely. Other wording was more cautious. But the good news is that for the moment, there's no imminent threat. And it would have been way more costly to stop this proposal if the government would have gone ahead with the bidding. So now we have to keep the pressure up. Number one, 109 hectares is just a fraction of the overall old growth logging proposals BC Timber Sales has developed. We found in their multi-year development plan, they had 8,800 hectares of old growth logging proposed on Vancouver Island. And we know that every year we are losing about 10,000 hectares on Vancouver Island alone. So the threat continues for most parts of Vancouver Island. And secondly, for the particular proposal, the BC government has to clarify whether they will fully cancel this proposal or if this is a postponement, for how long? How long do the people in this area have before they have to get ready to fight this again. And this also is a reminder that the current situation is unacceptable. There's a huge lack of transparency. It's too difficult for concerned citizens to find out about these proposals. We need more careful planning, and the First Nations, for example, the Pachida First Nation, need options, they need choices, they need opportunities to choose a path and not be forced to join in the resource extraction path that is not sustainable, because old growth forests are non-renewable resources. So that's the 2-minute update, and with this I want to pass it on to my colleagues and to Guy Dauncey, and looking forward to a discussion later and maybe time for a few more questions.
Thanks for that, Jens. So that's all the housekeeping and updates from us. I'd now like to introduce our guest speaker for this week, so Guy Dauncey. Guy is an eco-futurist who works to develop a positive vision of a sustainable future and to translate that vision into action. He's founder of the BC Sustainable Energy Association, co-founder of the Victoria Car Share Cooperative, and author or co-author of 9 books, including The Climate Challenge, 101 Solutions to Global Warming. So thank you so much for joining us today, Guy. We're really excited to hear from you. I'll just unmute you on the line, and then I'll hand over to you. Okay.
I press,
okay.
And I go to full screen, and we are off and rolling. All good?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay, we're talking Forestopia, 8 ways to protect the private forest. I work with the Yellow Point Eco Society up here north of Ladysmith, south of London. The purpose is to understand, appreciate, protect, and restore the ecosystems and watersheds in the Yellow Point area of Vancouver Island, and to inspire others to do the same. Coming out of this urgent sense that we really have to find a way to love our planet a lot better than we have been. The threat that's been, the news has been full of these threats just recently, the sense of urgency that's coming up. So people feel overwhelmed and disaster everywhere, no power to act. So we got to break free of that and really get ahead and change the world. We're at this, there's a sense there's a tipping point. The Extinction Rebellion people in London had a huge impact. The climate students striking are having huge impact. So there's a real struggle about, it's an unprecedented time for action right now. UK is now, the whole country has declared a climate emergency. Integration of climate understandings and forestry understandings are still quite weak, but they're growing. The new Green New Deal is beginning to go global with a sense of that. Canada now has a proposal out there as well. Called the Pact for a New Green Deal. And just 3 days ago, we had our second Green Member of Parliament elected here locally in Ladysmith and Imo, coming out of the sense that people have that, you know, we need to put urgency around the ecological crisis and the environmental crisis, and and the climate crisis. So it's a fundamental shift from ego thinking to eco thinking. So just to put in context, we've got the climate emergency, the ecological emergency, emergency of debt and inequality, another one, a cultural emergency crisis coming up with populism. The climate and ecological emergencies both combine in the forest emergency. I'm talking about Vancouver Island, and on Vancouver Island, we're talking there's crown lands, private managed forest lands, community-owned forest lands, and private lands. 4 distinct categories, have 4 distinct types of legislation and action needed on each of them. The old growth forest used to be just stupendously huge, and we used to glorify cutting down these trunks. And that was, you know, the kind of life it was. In First Nations days, 2 people might take 1 week to cut down a large cedar tree. When the first white settlers, 2 people might take 1 day to cut down a tree just with axes. Then with chainsaws, 1 person could take 1 hour. Now with a fella buncher, 1 machine can take 10 seconds to cut down a tree. That's the progress of machinery. And so we're left with this kind of, you know, stumpage and horror. So if we look firstly at the private managed forest lands, which is not today, but I wanted to cover them so that people understand what's happening here. The green is all crown land. The mauve is all private managed forest lands coming from the E&N rail grant of the 1880s. And it's split between 2 ownerships, with Island Timberlands having all the stuff of the rail grant in orange there, and Timber West adjacent, having the stuff in dark grey. So between them, they own a vast amount of Vancouver Island within the E&N rail grant. They have combined forces in a thing called Mosaic forest management to share a lot of resources and doing things together. And they're, interestingly, they're owned by the British Columbia Investment Management Corporation, the Sector Pension Investment Board, and the Alberta Investment Management Corporation. So the fact that the public sector workers are investing in Mosaic, they are investing in the destruction of forests on the private managed lands. And Mosaic's got this whole commitment, and one of their commitments is that they are certified through the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, which is not the same as the Forest Stewardship Initiative, which has authenticity. Sustainable Forestry Initiative is one put together by the forestry industry in response to the Forest Stewardship Initiative. And one of their standards in all this, and this is quite a big global standard, is, I'll search for before I come to that, there's a Timber West clear cut, there's another Timber West clear cut. This is the kind of forestry they're doing, logging on slopes that steep. And because of this, 4 major US brands have dropped the certification. And they introduce new standards in response to that pressure. One is that all non-certified forest content must be from, I'm losing the text on the right-hand side because of the photo boxes, I can't do that much, must be from non-controversial sources. And when we were trying to save 60 acres of land here in Yellow Point, which was being logged by a company in Campbell River, which was certified by these people, it was controversial. So we made a point about saying, this is a controversial issue. We need, this is the only leverage we had at the time. They didn't like that at all. They didn't like us putting that out. The whole thing's regulated by the Private Managed Forest Land Act. I haven't studied this. I'm not an expert on it, so I'm going to move right on. Private lands is one I really want to talk about. And it's all about the fact that people live close to the forest. We love the forest. We walk in it. We hike in it. We love nature. That's part of the whole thing. Forest gives us habitat, clean air, clean water, carbon storage, climate protection, beauty, and timber. And the 8 ways of approaching this, and I'll run through all of these as we come through. It's just a little way of packaging the 8 key themes of how we can protect the forest together. Ecotopia is the natural state of an undisturbed forest. In all its beauty, its species, it's too high. We know this stuff. We know what it's like. We know the magic of it. And this time of year is just amazing. It's being managed using the eco-forestry. So, being 3 examples: Wildwood, Proctor, and Stadtwald. Wildwood, just north of where I live, is 55 acres, managed by Merv Wilkinson from the 1940s through till the early part of the century, now the Eco-Forestry Institute Society. The primary drive of Merv's forest management plan was to ensure the overall health, diversity, resilience, and sustainability of the whole forest. He left logs and debris to decompose on the forest floor, to create habitat for forest creatures, and to build the future forest soil. He selected trees to cut based on the soil, light, and I wish I could read those right-hand words, other needs on the market, maximizing the value of each cut. He retained some large prime trees as sources of seed, never did any replanting, and depended on natural generation rather than planting of tree seedlings. He never harvested more than the annual growth rate so as not to deplete the forest. He encouraged birds and other wildlife and never used chemical pesticides. The birds were his main form of pest control. Barry Gates, who's a Cowichan-based forest stewardship forest manager in the Elkington land, is that Wilkington stands alone as probably the longest continuously managed ecoforest on the west coast of North America. It's a great example of what forests on Vancouver Island would look like if they had been managed ecologically rather than mined for their timber values. Today, it's stewarded by the Eco-Forestry Institute, which envisages a future where the principles of ecologically sustainable forestry are the foundation for all forest policy and practice. Harrop Proctor is on Kootenay Lake, 11,300 hectares. It's a combination of 2 organizations, the Harrop Proctor Community Cooperative, which manages the forest tenure and the mill, and the Harrop Proctor Watershed Protection Society, which undertakes monitoring of the plan activities, education and outreach, and ensures the watershed protection happens alongside forest management. It's gone beyond the normal community forest. It was set up when there were plans to clear cut the whole thing. It's Crown land, and the local people put up such a fuss, they got granted a local community forest license. They've been implementing an ecosystem-based plan as well as value-added strategies to expand local employment. The goal of ecosystem-based planning is to leave a fully functioning forest after logging takes place. So far, Harrop Proctor is the only community forest in BC with ecosystem-based plans at both a landscape level, which is like horizon to bottom of the watershed, and at the timber stand level. 30% of their forests can support sustainable timber management. So like we're talking, 3,000, 4,000 hectares. Stand level reserves are identified to protect small riparian areas, sensitive soils, old growth features, and wildlife habitat. Most harvesting is high retention, single tree or small group selection, with 60% retention of canopy trees. They do some small patch logging, mixed retention shelterwood logging, and all of their logging attempts to mimic natural forest disturbances. All harvesting operations use partial cutting to retain mature trees that are dispersed throughout the harvest area. They don't do any clear cutting. And they have their own mill that employs 4 people. They market their products into the environment, into the local community economy, and they're very much community engaged setup. Lübeck Stadtwald in Germany is based in the town of Lübeck up towards the Danish border. In 1994, and it's owned by the community. They have 5,000 hectares of land here. In 1994, their chief forester proposed that instead of logging using heavy machinery, followed by replanting in the old-fashioned way, he wanted to try a new approach called close to nature, which they developed in cooperation with scientists and nature conservationists. The plan was approved by a public referendum. The city now manages its forests to be a natural forest where nature can teach people how a forest helps sustain life on the planet, to meet the commercial needs of the forest industry, to enhance biodiversity and the preservation of natural habitats, and to sequestrate carbon as a climate solution. In practical terms, this means no clear cuts, no use of toxins or fertilizers, no surface clearing or slash burning, no use of large machines that would damage and compact the soil. Large trees are felled individually or in groups of 2 or 3, and 470 hectares are left untouched as a reference area so they can gauge what nature's doing to the forest and how their cutting areas compare. They use horses and light machinery to extract the logs so as to minimize damage to the soil. And their primary rule is to allow the forest to follow its own ecological nature. Over the long term, they seek a forest management path that would yield the lowest risk and the most productive development. So I want to switch now to the community-owned forest lands because Stadtwald is community-owned and Harrop Proctor is community-owned as well. And here on Vancouver Island, this is about democratopia, the practice of democracy to empower citizens and elected councils and regional directors to share at the management of local forests. Now, when you have a community-owned forest, it's fairly straightforward. In the private managed forest lands, they are in the jurisdiction of regional districts, but the regional directors have zero ability to influence the way things is done. So there's 2 things under democratopia. One is to practice community forest in a fully democratic way, and the other is to extend the power of regional directors to have influence and control over the way logging is done on the private managed forest lands that are part of Cowichan Regional District, Nanaimo Regional District, Comox-Courtney Regional District, etc. The North Cowichan Community Forest is 5,000 hectares that was acquired because in the 1930s, the Jippo loggers came out, clear cut the whole thing, and then walked away without paying taxes. As a result of that, the municipality acquired the land on the 6 mountains and all those green areas. That shows you the mountainous area of the land we're talking. And Aysel Dobell is a 4th generation local citizen who lived in the Maple Bay area for all her life, who walks the forest, knows it inside out. And she discovered that there were plans to expand the logging operations to cover her part of the forest. And she saw logging tape in December and started ringing alarm bells locally. No one really knew that it was owned by the community. They just assumed it was private or something else was going on. And she sort of rang the alarm bells. They had 400 people. They made an amazing video about the forest up there to show what was happening and how the clear cutting was happening. And basically said, what's the value of this? We need to stop, we need to pause all logging. They formed this thing called Where Do We Stand? and asking just to pause on logging in North Cowichan to allow the public consultation on the future of the 6 public forest reserves. Huge petition. 400 people showed up at a council meeting just before Christmas to sort of say, stop, we got to stop and think about all this. And we had a public assembly in the Cowichan Centre for the Performing Arts, and 600 people showed up for a massive big gathering with 10 speakers, all basically saying, pause the logging, reclaim democratic control, think what we're doing here. When you compare North Cowichan and Lubeck, the data is really interesting because the harvestable forest area in North Cowichan and Lubeck were very comparable. The annual allowable cut was relatively comparable. The actual cut in North Cowichan was 10,000 cubic meters, in Lubeck was 14,000 cubic meters. Seedlings planted in North Cowichan 49,000, Lubeck none, because they have natural regenerative process. Average clear cut in North Cowichan 7 hectares, Lubeck none, 0. Jobs created 8.5 in North Cowichan to 30 jobs in Lubeck. Income $1.1 million in North Cowichan to $1.9 million in Lubeck. So they're still harvesting timber off the forest. They're getting more jobs, they're getting more income, and they're protecting nature. That's what makes it such a really exciting model. Over on the island, people say, well, it's a beech forest, it's not Douglas fir, you can't compare, blah, blah, blah. But the data is really, I think, impressive. So now we come to the private lands on Vancouver Island. So Forestopia is the clustering of homes within a forest, enabling the rest of the forest to be protected. So when people own private land, they have certain development rights, 1 house per 5 acres, whatever it might be. A normal 20-acre lot, it'd be sold off 4 or 5 acre lots, and the owners clear cut the whole thing. If you cluster the homes, you can put the land on 4 1-acre lots and protect the rest of the forest as by covenant or by law. This is what clustered housing looks like. Houses are closer together, but it brings more community and neighborhood. It's the habit of having to have 5 acres of your own and live down a long driveway and never see your neighbors is ended by this way of living in the forest. And obviously, anyone who lives in a co-housing community knows how delightful this way of living is. You can do a lot of ecological protection while living in a clustered manner. And it's traditional and old as well, from Romania to Germany. This kind of clustering allows forest protection. The best example that is afraid on Vancouver is Elkington Forest. So that vast area of 900 acres of forest south of Shawnigan Lake. Down at the bottom of the green area is the area where a road has gone in, and that tiny little triangle area at the right-hand side is where, that's the view from the top of the forest. All these forested lands are being protected because of allowing development in this one clustered corner, which my friend Doug McCarroff was working on, and this is what it was going to look like. That's the one house they got built before, alas, the project fell afoul of the far too expensive costs of doing septic and water treatment up in the forest and went bankrupt. So it's now, it will reappear because bankruptcy sort of clears the books, but the forest is still protected as Elkington Forest. So the project still remains, it's going to take a new commercial form. Then we come to Covenantopia, which is the permanent protection of a forest by means of a conservation covenant placed on the land by its owner. So here in Yellow Point, we dug into this to find out just what's involved. And we had Keith from Yad Galliano come over and talk to us because they've done some normal covenant is simply a conservation covenant where the rule is no one ever does a thing. We want an eco-forestry covenant. You can manage on eco-forestry principles and still protect the forest itself. What we discover is that the land trusts that hold the covenant require about $12,000 down payment to allow for the fact that they have to come and inspect that covenant, the land, every year for eternity. That's the way the covenant works. So they've got to have the money set aside to do that. And so that's the $12,000 is quite a put off. So I'm hoping to negotiate that with them that instead of a $12,000 single down payment, you can actually have an annual payment by the new landowner who is paying what, $300 a year, and it's that annual payment is built into title. Then the continuation is within as well. Now, if you have a conservation property tax incentive, which rewards landowners who place conservation or eco-forestry covenants on their land, your then municipal taxes are reduced in the same way that they are on agricultural land, and that annual tax saving covers the cost of the surveying you have to do and of the conservation protection covenant stuff. This happens in the Gulf Islands and the Islands Trust, but nowhere else that I know of. that's a legal initiative we need to get brought in to give the landowners the incentive to go to the trouble and expense of putting covenants on their land. Come to Forestopia, which is more straightforward, the permanent protection of a forest as parkland. And it seems straightforward, but it's not actually. I mean, Commander-Wallbrand Provincial Park became a park because Commander-Wallbrand Society, the Wilderness Committee and others went out, campaigned, got people in the forest, did trail building, got activists falling in love, put the political pressure on to get it turned into a park. These things don't happen on their own. You know, the Yellow Point Park where we live became because of campaigning and pressure. Then you get the beauty that remains, but it takes work. What can assist this is regional conservation funds to have a small increase in municipal taxes to purchase private properties for conservation purposes. We need more of those. We need them all over the province as a standard form of contribution to our municipal taxes. Then we come to Regulatopia, which is mentally more complex, which is the protection of forests by provincial and local regulation to end clear cutting and to require ecoforestry methods and the clustering of permitted houses. So now we're intruding onto private landowners' assumed rights, which is you can do what the hell you want with your land. And we're saying no, that the whole ethos of land ownership needs to change from ownership to stewardship. When you have under the development permits protection for Yellow Point Aqua, for instance, where we live, these are all exemptions. If you look into the zoning bylaws, you'll find these exemptions. Any subdivision of land which are three or fewer lots, that doesn't matter. Land alteration, those two words mean logging. You can get exemption for land logging, no requirement to even notify or consult the adjacent property owners. You can construct buildings, do adjustments, all that sort of stuff, and it's all exempt from the development permit legislation. So what we want is a new development permit area rule that will classify all coastal Douglas fir forest as an endangered ecosystem, which it is, allow environmentally sensitive DPAs to be created by local governments requiring a permit for any subdivision and any clearing of land, requiring clustering or carefully placed housing with the remaining forest being covenanted either as parkland or for ecoforestry methods of timber management. So this isn't increasing the number of units you're allowed to build on the land, but it's not taking them away either. So if someone owns 20 acres of forest and they're entitled to build 4 homes on it, they can still build their homes if they cluster them, and they can still take trees out of the forest as long as they do it on ecoforestry methods, but clear cutting is basically banned using this development permit area rule. This can be done within existing legislation. All it takes is it needs citizen mobilization to persuade the elected regional directors and the planners that there's a political will to do this, because it will be a battle. There'll be landowners who come around and say, you've got no right to tell me what to do on my land. So you've got to do the political work and get the rules changed. In the regional district of Nanaimo's OCP, they already state that they want clustering, smaller parcels, subdivisions for the present environmentally sensitive units, as long as it has more development. So the OCPs are documents collected by citizens to say, what's our vision of the future of our land? They do not trump the zoning laws. The zoning laws have practiced legally. And so unless you're applying for rezoning, an OCP doesn't kick in. But the OCPs show the will of the people and how they want their community to be. We're also floating the idea of a coastal Douglas fir land reserve, similar to the agricultural land reserve, which would be in position, basically saying to the same effect as the development permit area legislation, which is saying in all coastal Douglas fir land, future development housing must be clustered and forestry must be managed on an ecological basis, no clear cutting. And one NDP MLA said he will never achieve that, and the other said that's a good idea, get to work. So it's an idea. We haven't done much further work on it yet, but we're putting it out there as a concept. So basically, all the dark green area, we're saying that development's still permitted but clustered, logging still permitted but using ecoforestry methods. So it's a paradigm shift, both in the way of we doing housing development and in forest management. And then finally, come to you, the happy state of being a champion for the forest, because without you and I getting involved to make this stuff happen, business as usual prevails. And business as usual right now means a fellow buncher machine. and no consultation with anyone. It means us working together to do this, because we can't do it alone. It means making a difference, and so, you know, linking the power of the climate movement and the ecological emergency movement with the forest movement to make people realize these things connect. Our forests are an essential means of climate protection, watershed protection, ecological protection. We need to bind them together into one movement to know that we can make a difference on this thing, and we have to make a difference. So that's my book, Journey to the Future, that sort of spells out a future set in 2032 that covers all this stuff. That's my website, The Practical Utopian. And I believe that was less than half an hour. There we go, I'm done. You can go back to full screen.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Guy. I can leave those slides there for the moment, and I'll just hand to Jens. I'll unmute Jens. There you go.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can now, yes.
All right. Thanks so much, Guy, and thanks, John. And I see a few comments and questions here, so I will go through them. So, for example, Thomas, can Douglas fir be generated without patch cutting or clear cutting? Does anybody have info on what happened at Wildwood with Douglas fir regeneration? Is the stand shifting towards hemlock and cedar? So very specific questions. Guy, do you have?
From what I know, the answer is no. There's regeneration of Douglas fir and cedar. I'm not a forest ecologist myself. I've done tours of no one's ever shown any concern about the basic ecological standards changing.
Right.
The cedar, the fir likes the openings in the light to reach up. The cedar works in darkness, and so small openings, and the Doug fir will reach up to the top, and they regrow. They reseed quite happily on the ground.
Yes, and one thing we know for sure, we know that Douglas fir and other coastal tree species would have regenerated for thousands of years without human intervention, or at least no major human intervention, right, in terms of natural regeneration and any altering, any intervention in the ecosystem by First Nations over the last 10,000 years would have been minor without major cutting beyond individual trees.
Yeah, and obviously blowdown happens. I mean, a lot of trees come down in the storms, and blowdowns open up clearings in the canopy.
Yeah, good reminder.
The seedlings rush up into the clearing. Yeah.
Yes, so in some cases this will probably result in a shift in tree species if it's a major blowdown. So one general comment I can make is that if you have specific questions that one of us might not be able to answer today, you can email me at jens@sierraclub.bc.ca. I can ask other experts to provide additional information.
Yeah.
So, doesn't the Private Managed Forest Act prevent local regulation under certain circumstances? See Section 21.
I did not come prepared to discuss the private managed land because I know it's a different regulatory regime, and I think as June Ross might know more about this because she's been working on this quite actively. Is June there? Do you want to unmute June and have her chip in?
We can see if June is
She was the very first person to sign up, so at the very beginning of that.
Available. Yeah. June, are you able to share? Would you like to share anything on this?
I don't know how much I can share. I mean, yes, I'm upset with all the logging that's going on. I think it's horrific, and we have to find a way to get it stopped. And private managed land, I mean, it's worse than the Forest Act itself. It's not anywhere near it. It doesn't touch it even. So it's I don't know what else I can add. It's not a nice act, and that is the one that is harming so many of us here on the island.
Yeah, you're right. You're totally right. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thanks.
Thank you for that, June. Okay, there's a few more questions in the box. You know, this one's from Meadow. yeah, I think it's quite simply, what's the best route to stopping people from buying up tracts of lands and just logging the hell out of them? Just at a basic level.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very pertinent question, because when we were trying to save that 60 acres, we discovered the only way to save it, because the regulations weren't there, was to buy it. Unfortunately, they wanted $2 million. They bought it for $900,000. They wanted $2 million, and we're a very small community, and the Nanaimo Area Land Trust told us that would take about 4 years of non-stop campaigning, and we thought it just wasn't going to happen. So what I wished that I had in my back pocket was a stewardship land development company. So if the nonprofit community was really organized, we would set up our own development company. We would accumulate people's savings. And then for instance, there's a parcel of land up at Qualicum, 50 acres to 100 acres right now on the market. And anyone can get in there and buy it. And then you can choose to get the money back by clustering the housing in one corner and protecting 90% of the forest. My drawback is I've always been on the consultant side of the table. When you do your work, submit a bill and get paid. If you're on the developer side, you have to pay people. You're borrowing money. Maybe you've got that money out from the banks or your investors for 2 or 3 years while you go through the zoning process, taking risk, and hope to make a profit that pays back your investor. So that takes courage, and we urgently need a social enterprise that would do that and set up a not-for-profit development company that can buy the land before it gets pillaged, and then refinance the purchase by the development of the permitted dwellings in a clustered corner and put covenants on the rest of the land. So Meadow, if you've got $5 million and you want to set that up, I'm happy to advise you. And any inheritees, I mean, this could be something that's the kind of thing people get together. People inherit money. There's money around. I mean, we all of our RSP money is right now leaving the island and being invested in Toronto. The right channel, it could be earning 5 to 8% here on the island while saving the forest at the same time. But as environmentalists, we have to be willing to step into the development community's court and become business people with a non-profit motive, or it could be a cooperative, it could be social enterprise, and play their game, because otherwise they're playing the game and they get the first choice of everything.
We need really, we need really large-scale solutions for this, similar like in the Great Bear Rainforest, where we had a $120 funding mechanism. Half of the money came from private funders, primarily organized by the Nature Conservancy, 30 million from the federal government, 30 million from the provincial government, and we need funding mechanisms like this, both for public lands to enable conservation solutions and for private lands. So that's one of the asks to the BC government to provide more funding, create new funding mechanisms, and we are not seeing it yet. So that's another reason why we have to increase the pressure, because once governments are involved, that can help to bring in more private funding, and that can create matching funding mechanisms and so on.
What I'm getting at for this particular theme, it only really applies on private land, but potentially on the private managed forest land if Timber West were going to sell, which they're never going to do, is that there's profit to be made on all of these private land parcels. They all have zoning for houses to be built on them. And we have a massive desire for people to come and live on Vancouver Island. And I'm pretty sure that if someone was able to build a forest hamlet, cluster of 20 homes in a co-housing style, your waiting list of people wanting to buy them would be 100 people long, because it's a very desirable way to live with a whole park in your backyard. And it means that we need to get the credit unions involved. It's not so much needing government finance to be given out of taxpayers' money, it's credit union finance, and it's for-profit finance that can be engaged in a social enterprise where the purpose of the business is not to make profit for the investors, but just to sort of guarantee a 5% return and make profit for the forest ecologically.
Thanks, Guy. We have one more here wondering about how to stop auctioning of land. I think this could be related to BC timber sales.
Yes, so maybe you can address that.
So exactly. So there's a whole question about the mechanism why we have BC timber sales. So the government insists that BC timber sales is needed as a market mechanism to assess the value of the timber, and they need it as a contribution to regulate the market. But the most important point in the context of BC timber sales existence and the mechanism of auctioning is that they have responsibility. They are designing the cut blocks, and they should be leaders in terms of best practices. They should be the champion in terms of moving away from logging old growth to improved management of second growth forests. All of this would be possible because they're fully controlled by the BC government. The BC government has the power to direct BC timber sales, how to do business. This could be a real opportunity. Again, it all goes back to the importance of keeping the pressure up and forcing the government to do what's right. And it means if we have BC timber sales, they must be a leader for conservation practices and for improved forest management. And right now, worst, the list of atrocious, of terrible logging practices in a number of places is long. So keep the pressure up. I'm moving on because we have only a few minutes left. Next comment here is from Don. Having worked on the process, Vancouver Island land use planning process, I would caution that the details of what constitutes eco-logging can be co-opted by industry. McBlow claimed to have quit clear-cutting by leaving an occasional eye in the clear cuts.
Yeah, we'll leave 3 trees standing. It's still clear cutting, even if they give it a different name and get upset. So
yes,
I think basically when we looked at having an ecoforestry covenant, rather than define what ecoforestry is, you can define it negatively, which says that an opening in the canopy can be never big than so many square meters. Because clearly when a tree falls by a storm blow, you get an opening in the canopy, but you've got a natural opening rather than cut opening. McBlow just in the heads off that we think that was, if it just, yeah.
Thanks. What are we to make of the dying salal in these ecosystems?
I mean, I've seen this, Diane. It's I think it's likely a combination of cold and drought together. That we had the drought impacted March. Like it's so unusual to get the whole period of March without any water, plus the cold might have done it. But until we get some good ecological analysis, it's not happening in our part of the world around here. I know it's happening up at Cumble River. So until a good ecologist has done analysis, I don't know the answers to that, Diana.
Only comment is that it's likely related to a shifting climate. We all know that weather events are shifting, and that means related to climate change. And I think it will be difficult to verify, but it's clearly a reminder that many plants and animals have tipping points, just like the Arctic and certain forests. There's simply points where it's related to humidity or to temperature, where we will see animals or plants die off, and it is possible that this is one of the examples.
So wearing my climate change hat, I know that you've got atmospheric stuff and you've got weather, and in between there's jet stream stuff. Mm-hmm. And jet stream is getting really messed up with and demobilized, and it's getting in places. So you get periods of a whole month of drought and a whole month of downpour and a whole month of heat wave. So the disturbance of patterns, which could cause the fact that we had March without any rain, and now we're looking like have the whole of May without any rain. And our whole rainfall on the island is about 58% of normal. So the snowpack June shared some interesting data on this recently, is really down, which means that our fire risk is going to be very high. So these things are all got climate change footprint. I'm stopping to use the term climate change. It's either climate breakdown, climate emergency, or climate catastrophe is the language we need to use, climate crisis. They've got that footprint all over it in what we're seeing.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
Moving through the last few, because we have only time for one or two more. So encourage you all to read the, some of the comments, but I will choose another question right now. Why not lobby for private land logging regulations instead of community members having to take the risk?
Well, that's what I'm talking about with the development permit area rules. If we did get those rules changed, then there would be no fear, because a regular predatory capitalist coming along to buy forest would not be allowed to clear cut the land.
Yeah.
So far, I haven't even written a paper on. Most people you talk about development permit areas and their brains phase in, and they don't understand the difference between OCPs and APCs and rezoning and the stuff like that. So we've got to get clarity, which is what I'm hoping I can do in this webinar, that the point of leverage is the development permit area rules. And then the secondary point of leverage is the 9 regional directors that sit.
Yeah.
Because you've got to be able to take a proposal to regional board. You've got to have talked in advance to regional directors to know that the motion gets even the minimal advance, like let's study it, you need a vote of 5 against 4. And you've got to have community support saying we want this in advance, so that there's not a freak out within the private landowners who want the right to log their land and do what they want with it would have a knee-jerk reaction and scupper the whole thing. So it's highly political. It needs a new level of organization tied to a good understanding of the local regulations within the regional districts.
John, do we have time for another one, or do we have to?
I think if it's a short one you've got lined up, then yes, but very close to needing to bring this to an end.
I don't think they are short ones, but in terms of the last question, I would simply add that we need both. We need stronger private land logging regulation, because we have to shift the baseline, like needed to communities, clean water, clean air, habitat must shift. And then we still need the solutions that Guy described that would allow communities to go beyond that, to go to seek full protection or far-reaching protection mechanisms in the areas where they live on private lands. I think we will leave it at this. I included my email address so that if people want to follow up, they can email me. I can pass on questions to Guy or other people if I don't have the answer. And I think John.
Yeah, that's great. I'll just wrap things up now from this end. So thanks, Jens, for your input today, and thank you, Guy, for a fascinating and engaging talk. It's been a real privilege having you with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone on the line, for your engagement, including some speakers on the line today. Just a reminder that, you can email Jens questions using the email address he provided. And we also have the Facebook group, Sierra Club BC Volunteers Facebook group, for more discussion there. Just before we end today's call, I'd like to set the action for this coming week. As Galen previously mentioned, we're planning a province-wide day of action on Thursday, June the 6th, calling on the BC government to protect our old-growth forests. Now, we're just looking to help the BC government understand how many of us are deeply unhappy with the logging of old growth that's happening, all around us. And what we're planning on happening on the day is large numbers of people showing up at their local MLA's office demanding protection of old growth. So we'd like people to turn up with signs. The more creative, the better. Perhaps using information that you've learned from this webinar series to create them. At some of the offices, we'll see speakers address the crowd as well for the larger gatherings. The point of this is to raise awareness of how many of us are unhappy with old growth logging, keeping pressure on the government, and having a good number of people there on the day. That's the kind of important. You may wish to notify your MLA in advance that you'll be there, but this isn't required at all. And just to note that these events will be fully peaceful and fully legal. It'll be a good atmosphere on the day where we get to stand up for what we believe in, surrounded by like-minded people doing the same thing. So the action for this coming week is just to let us know if you think you might be able to participate in the June 6th event, Thursday, June 6th, noon or slightly before. So we're doing on a weekday to make sure that the MLA, or to maximize the chances of the MLA being there. And if you are planning on participating, if you could let us know where, that would be great. You can send these emails, this information by email to Galen, or you can post it in our Sierra Club BC Volunteers Facebook group. We've got another exciting talk lined up for next week. We'll be joined by Valerie Langer, who is a solutions specialist at Canopy. Valerie has been engaged in forest conservation campaigns for over 20 years, including taking part in the collaborative process that developed ecosystem-based management in the Great Bear Rainforest. Today, Valerie's focused on accelerating next-generation solutions as an alternative to using primary forests for pulp and paper textiles. So we're really looking forward to that talk next week. If you've enjoyed this webinar series, we invite you to become a sustaining member of Sierra Club BC by making a monthly donation. Your support for our mission of defending BC's natural environment within the urgent context of climate change really is deeply appreciated. So in closing, it's been really enjoyable hosting such an interesting talk and discussion today. Thanks to all of you for taking part, and thanks to Guy especially and Jens, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week. So thanks all, bye-bye.
Thank you.